There's a common misconception that Plato was a feminist. It seems like this idea has been floating around for a while. First off, what exactly did Plato say about women? The passage that always gets cited here comes from Book 5 of the Republic. It's clear that Plato didn't really believe that women should be equals to men. Let me explain. In order to understand what Plato was doing in the Republic, we have to pay close attention to the context. We also have to remember that this is ancient Athens we're talking about. Athenian women had absolutely no rights. They were treated like property. He wasn't worried about the plight of the average woman. In fact, he didn't seem to care much about the plight of most men either. He despised the idea that ordinary citizens could participate in politics. In the Symposium, Plato uses the character Diotima to explain how the human soul begins its pursuit of knowledge. The soul starts out by pursuing physical beauty and pleasure, but quickly realizes that this isn't enough. So it moves to the realm of ideas. If we just look at his views on women without considering the sexism of his time, then yeah, he was probably ahead of his day. But the problem with trying to make Plato into a feminist is that we ignore his limitations. Yes, he advocated for women's education, but he never really challenged the patriarchal structures that were in place. For Plato, women were still seen as inferior to men. They were still denied access to political power, and they were still relegated to the domestic sphere. This is where it encounters the beautiful itself, which represents all beauty. And at this moment, the soul overflows with love and affection. Plato was a product of ancient Athens, and his thought is best understood in light of that. If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe. Thank you for watching. And it wants to reproduce this experience, so it falls in love with other people. This is why he had such a low opinion of most men. He didn't think that they were smart enough to govern themselves. But then he goes and applies this same logic to women. How do we reconcile those two things? Well, the answer is that we can't. We can't reconcile Plato's sexism with his advocacy for women's education. And that's why many scholars argue that we shouldn't read Plato as a feminist. He was a product of his time, and his views on women reflect that. He made some progress, sure, but he never fully escapes the patriarchal mindset. Plato's ideal city is an oligarchy ruled by a small group of philosopher kings. Everyone else, whether male or female, had a predetermined role that they could never escape. The soul will only fall in love with someone if they are more beautiful than the person that they in love with. Now for men, this means that they will only fall in love with other men. But for women, this isn't possible because women are by nature less beautiful than men. So the only person they can fall in love with is the beautiful itself. They cannot reproduce the experience. They can only contemplate it. This is why, according to Plato, men are the ones who actively pursue love, while women are the ones who simply receive it. Men go out into the world and seek love, while women wait around for love to find them. This is how Plato explains the gender differences in love, and it clearly shows us that he never really breaks free from traditional Athenian values. They were born into it, and that's how it stayed. This is why Plato also advocated for a class of lower-class women who would be owned by the guardians. Their purpose was to bear children for the military class. They weren't educated like the elite women, nor were they free to choose their own partners. They were literally possessions. They could be bought and sold. They could be abused and beaten. Their husbands could even kill them. There was nothing unusual about this. So in Plato's eyes, advocating for women to be educated is a massive step forward. He is giving them something they would never have otherwise gotten. At the very least, his famous quote, "Woman is the weaker vessel," needs to be understood in light of the sexism that was normal at the time. He was still miles ahead of his contemporaries. But saying that women should be allowed to do the same things as men isn't necessarily feminist. He's simply rejecting a restrictive view of women, not embracing a radical egalitarian one. For Plato, the purpose of the ideal city was to make the philosopher king. His goal was to show how justice works in the soul by showing how it works in a city. This is why the first 4 books of the Republic focus on creating the perfect city before turning to the individual soul in Book V. Now, the philosopher king was a male role. Women could never become philosopher kings. They could never rule the city. Their job was to serve the male philosopher kings. Where Socrates is talking with various characters about whether or not women should be allowed to participate in the education of boys. These women would be married off to soldiers and would have children with them. Their sole purpose in life is to bear children for the military class. So when we read about the education of women in Book 5, we have to keep in mind that Plato is only talking about the education of wives and mothers. He specifically excludes them from political office. Remember, the philosopher king is still a male. At the time, Athenian women were excluded from education, especially higher-level philosophical education. This is why Plato wrote his dialogues. He wanted to make a case for why women should be educated. His argument is simple. There is no natural difference between men and women that would prevent them from learning the same things. They both have the capacity for reason and rationality, so they should both be allowed to pursue philosophy. You sometimes see people on social media claiming that he was ahead of his time when it came to gender equality, because in one of his dialogues, he says that women should be allowed to do the same things men can, at least in theory. And some take this to mean that Plato was a full-blown feminist who believed that women should have the right to vote and participate in politics. But is this really what Plato was getting at? Or does his thought have some deeper challenges for modern feminism? In this episode, we're going to look at why Plato's views on women actually undermine rather than support modern feminism. Socrates asks, isn't the female soul just as capable of grasping the principles of the eternal as the male? In fact, Socrates argues that it might even be better to educate women because their bodies are weaker than men. So, they need philosophy more as a way to defend themselves against the body's weakness. As he says, woman needs philosophy even more than man, since she is by nature less able to speculate about the truth. Now, this doesn't mean that Plato thought women were inferior to men. That wasn't what he was arguing at all. Rather, he was arguing that there is no rational basis for denying women access to philosophy, and that doing so is actually harmful to women because it leaves them defenseless against their own weakness. If anything, he was accusing the sophists of being sexist for claiming that women were too weak to handle philosophy. Remember, these are the same guys who said that women couldn't handle politics. Plato was challenging the status quo. He wanted women to be educated, and this is why feminists have taken him to be one of their own. But there's a lot more to his view of women than just this one passage. If you read his work in its entirety, this is why, as we read in Book 4, Plato advocates for a class of auxiliary women. And if that sounds crazy, well, you're not wrong, but we can't stop there. Another thing we have to remember is that Plato was primarily concerned with the education of elite women. It's also important to note that Plato wasn't a fan of democracy. One way that we can see this is by looking at his theory of love. Now, once again, this is where Plato's sexism shines through, because according to Diotima, so is Plato a feminist? Well, in a vacuum, sure. If anything, Plato's views on women were more progressive than those of his contemporaries. But that's not really saying much.